Welcome to Crime Story Chronicles. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button for more eerie, true crime mysteries. And to all our returning viewers, thank you for being part of this journey into the darkest corners of human nature. You're young, in love, and seeking privacy beneath the star-filled Italian sky. The hills of Florence stretch endlessly around you, bathed in moonlight, as you and your partner find a secluded spot to be alone. But as the night deepens, something moves in the shadows, something that has been watching, waiting, planning. What began as a romantic evening is about to become a nightmare that will terrorize an entire region for decades. Between 1968 and 1985, 8 couples would meet their fate in the countryside surrounding Florence, Italy. Their deaths would spawn one of the most complex and controversial criminal investigations in modern European history. Tonight, I'm taking you deep into the case that horrified a nation and left investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about serial murder. Our story begins on a sultry August evening in 1968. 29-year-old Antonio Lobianco had been married for just 6 months to his beautiful wife, Barbara Lacci. But their marriage was far from perfect. Barbara had a reputation, one that whispered through the narrow streets of Florence like a scandal waiting to explode. Barbara was known for her affairs, her hunger for excitement beyond the confines of matrimony. On that fateful night, she wasn't with her husband. Instead, she'd driven to a remote spot in Signa, just outside Florence, with her lover, a married man named Giovanni Foggi. They thought they were alone in the darkness. They were wrong. The next morning, a passerby discovered their bodies. Barbara lay crumpled outside their car, her dress torn, her life stolen by a single gunshot. Giovanni was found slumped over the steering wheel, killed by the same .22 caliber weapon. But this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was something far more sinister. The killer had used a specific type of ammunition, .22 caliber Winchester series, H cartridges. The forensics team would later discover that these bullets had been fired from a rare Beretta pistol, one that would link this murder to a string of terror that hadn't even begun yet. But in 1968, investigators believed they had their man. Stefano Mele, Barbara's estranged husband, was arrested within days. His alibi was shaky, his motive clear, a jealous husband eliminating his cheating wife and her lover. Case closed, the police thought. Mele was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison. But the monster of Florence was far from finished. 13 years passed. Stefano Mele sat in his prison cell, serving his sentence for the murders of his wife and Giovanni Foggi. The hills of Florence had returned to their peaceful rhythm, young couples once again seeking privacy beneath the Tuscan stars. Then, on September 14, 1974, the nightmare returned. Pasquale Gentilcore, 19 years old, and Stefania Pettini, 18, had driven to a quiet spot in Borgo San Lorenzo. They were planning to spend the night together, away from prying eyes and disapproving families. As they settled into the back seat of Pasquale's car, sharing whispered promises and tender kisses. Death stalked them through the darkness. The killer approached with methodical precision. 8 shots rang out through the night air. The same .22 caliber Winchester bullets that had killed Barbara and Giovanni 6 years earlier. But this time, something was different. This time, the killer wasn't satisfied with just murder. When police arrived the next morning, they found Pasquale's body in the driver's seat, multiple gunshot wounds ending his young life. But Stefania's body told a more horrifying story. She had been dragged from the car, her clothing torn away, her body violated with a grapevine branch. The killer had mutilated her with surgical precision, removing parts of her anatomy as twisted trophies. The ballistics report confirmed what investigators feared most. The same weapon had been used in both attacks. But Stefano Mele was still in prison, his cell door locked tight. Either they had convicted the wrong man in 1968, or someone else now possessed the murder weapon. The question that would haunt investigators for decades had just been born. Who was the monster of Florence? As news of the second double murder spread through Florence, panic began to grip the city. Young couples who had once found romance in the rolling hills now stayed home, afraid to venture into the darkness. But the killer was patient, methodical. He could wait. 3 years passed before he struck again. On June 6, 1981, Giovanni Foggi, no relation to the earlier victim, and Carmela Nuccio were found dead in their car near Scandicci. The same .22 caliber weapon, the same brutal precision. But this time, investigators began to understand the monster's true nature. The killer was a voyeur, a predator who fed on the intimacy of others. He would watch couples, learning their habits, their vulnerabilities. He knew when they were most defenseless, most exposed, and when the moment was right, he would strike with the cold efficiency of a hunter taking prey. Dr. Francesco Introna, one of Italy's leading forensic pathologists, studied the crime scenes with growing unease. The killer's signature was becoming clearer with each attack. He always targeted couples in parked cars. He always used the same weapon. And he always took certain parts of the female victim's body as trophies. A detail so disturbing that police kept it from the public for years.
We knew we were dealing with someone who had killed before, someone who would kill again. The precision, the ritual, this wasn't random violence. This was someone who had perfected his method, who found pleasure in the hunt itself.
But the monster wasn't finished teaching Florence about fear. His next lesson would be the most brutal yet. October 23rd, 1981. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves as 26-year-old Stefano Baldi drove through the countryside with his girlfriend, Susanna Cambi. They were heading to a secluded spot they'd discovered months earlier, a place where they could be alone beneath the stars. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree-line, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attack came without warning. 8 shots, fired with mechanical precision. Stefano died instantly, his body slumping over the steering wheel. But Susanna lived long enough to experience the monster's true depravity. She was dragged from the car, her clothing torn away, her body subjected to horrors that would haunt the investigators who found her. The killer had grown bolder, more confident. He took his time with Susanna, using her body to send a message to the investigators who pursued him. He was in control. He was unstoppable. And he was just getting started. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. Families demanded answers. Politicians called for action. The media sensationalized every detail, turning the monster into a boogeyman that haunted the collective consciousness of Tuscany. But despite their best efforts, investigators were no closer to identifying the killer than they had been in 1968. The case against Stefano Mele had always been circumstantial. He had motive, his wife's infidelity. He had access. He knew where Barbara would be that night. But the ballistics evidence linking the 1968 murders to the later killings had shattered the prosecution's case. If Mele was the killer, how had he committed murders while locked in a prison cell? In 1982, investigators returned to question Mele about the original murders. What they discovered would change the direction of their investigation forever. Mele's story had always been inconsistent, full of holes and contradictions. But under renewed pressure, he finally revealed a truth that had been hidden for over a decade.
I didn't kill my wife. I know who did, but I was afraid to tell you. There were others involved that night. People who wanted Barbara dead for their own reasons.
Mele's confession opened a door that investigators had never considered. What if the 1968 murders weren't a crime of passion at all? What if they were part of something larger, more complex? A conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Stefano Mele's revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. If he wasn't the killer, then who was? And more importantly, how had the real murderer obtained the weapon that would terrorize Florence for decades? The answers would lead investigators into a labyrinth of secrets, lies, and betrayal that stretched back to that first night in 1968. According to Mele, the plot to kill Barbara Lacci had been hatched by a group of men connected to her various affairs. Barbara hadn't just been cheating on her husband. She had been involved with multiple men simultaneously, creating a web of jealousy and resentment that would eventually consume her. Francesco Vinci, a married man who had been having an affair with Barbara, allegedly provided the gun, a .22 caliber Beretta that would become the monster's signature weapon. But Vinci wasn't just any adulterer. He was part of a Sardinian clan with a history of violence. Men who settled disputes with blood rather than words. The investigation suddenly had new suspects: Francesco Vinci, his brother Salvatore, and their associate Giovanni Mele, Stefano's own brother. According to the new theory, one of these men had killed Barbara and Giovanni, then kept the murder weapon as a trophy. But 14 years later, that same weapon had resurfaced in the hands of serial killer. The ballistics evidence was undeniable. The same gun had been used in all the murders, from 1968 to 1981. But the forensic team made another disturbing discovery. The bullets used in the later killings have been stored for years, possibly decades. They showed signs of age, oxidation, and unusual were patterns that suggested they had been kept in less than ideal conditions. Dr. Giancarlo Costagliola, the lead ballistics expert, made a chilling observation. The killer wasn't just using the same weapon. He was using the same batch of ammunition, bullets that had been manufactured years earlier and stored carefully, like a precious collection. It was as if the monster had inherited not just a gun, but an entire arsenal from the original killers. In 1982, Francesco Vinci was arrested and charged with the 1968 murders. Under interrogation, he maintained his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with Barbara's death. But his alibi was weak, his connections to the other suspects undeniable. For a brief moment, it seemed like the monster case might finally be solved. The media proclaimed victory. The monster had been caught. The nightmare was over. But on September 9th, 1983, while Francesco Vinci sat in his prison cell, 2 more bodies were discovered in the hills outside Florence. The monster had struck again, proving that the wrong man was behind bars. The discovery of Horst Meyer and Uwe Rush's bodies shattered any remaining confidence in the investigation. These weren't just any victims. They were 2 West German tourists who had been camping in the Tuscan countryside, seeking adventure in the romantic hills of Italy. Their deaths would prove that the monster was evolving, becoming more desperate and dangerous than ever before. Meyer and Rush had set up their tent in a remote area near Galuzzo, far from the typical parking spots where couples went to be alone. They thought they were safe, hidden from the world in their own private sanctuary. But the monster had been watching, waiting, planning his next move. The attack came in the early hours of the morning. 8 shots, fired with the same mechanical precision that had marked all the previous murders. But this time, something was different. This time, the killer had made a mistake. The scene was more chaotic than the others, less controlled. The killer had been forced to work in unfamiliar territory, without the contained environment of a car to limit his victim's movements. One of the tourists had tried to run, his body found several meters from the tent. The other had been killed inside the shelter, his blood staining the nylon walls. But the monster had maintained his signature brutality. Parts of one victim's body had been removed with surgical precision, taken as trophies, just like the female victims in previous attacks. The killer wasn't just hunting couples anymore. He was hunting anyone who dared to seek privacy in his domain. The German murders changed everything. The monster was no longer predictable, no longer confined to a specific victim profile. The entire investigation had to be reconsidered from the ground up. But with Francesco Vinci still in prison, investigators were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been chasing shadows while the real killer remained free. Vinci was released in 1984. The charges against him dropped in light of the new evidence. But his freedom came with a price. He was now a marked man, forever connected to the monster case in the public mind. And the real killer was still out there, patient as ever, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. By 1985, the monster had terrorized Tuscany for over a decade. 8 people were dead. Countless others lived in fear, and the investigation had consumed the careers of dozens of law enforcement officers. But the killer wasn't finished. He had one final lesson to teach about the true nature of evil. July 29, 1985, Jean-Michel Crevecoeur, a 25-year-old French tourist, was camping with his girlfriend, Nadine Marais, in the hills near San Casciano. They were young, in love, and blissfully unaware that they were about to become the monster's final victims. The couple had chosen a secluded spot, far from the main tourist routes. They thought they were alone, safe in their own private world. But the monster had been watching them, studying their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attack came without warning. Jean-Michel was killed instantly, his body found outside the tent where he had tried to flee. But Nadine's fate was far worse. She was dragged from the tent, her clothing torn away, her body subjected to the same ritualistic mutilation that had marked all the female victims. When investigators arrived the next morning, they found something that chilled them to the bone. The killer had left behind a calling card, a small piece of Nadine's body, carefully placed where it would be discovered. It was a message, a final taunt from a predator who believed he was untouchable. The ballistics report confirmed what everyone already knew. The same weapon had been used, the same ammunition, the same methodical precision. But this time, the killer had grown careless. He had left behind more evidence than ever before, including footprints, fabric fibers, and traces of DNA that would later prove crucial to the investigation. The French murders sent shockwaves through Europe. The monster wasn't just Italy's problem anymore. He was killing international tourists, threatening the very foundation of Tuscany's tourism industry. The pressure to solve the case reached a breaking point. Politicians demanded action. The media called for heads to roll. Families of the victims organized protests, demanding justice for their loved ones. But despite the massive resources devoted to the case, despite the hundreds of investigators and thousands of hours of work, the monster remained a phantom. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. The monster of Florence vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only questions, trauma, and the haunting knowledge that evil had walked among them for 17 years. In the aftermath of the French murders, the investigation took a turn that no one could have predicted. The pressure to solve the case had reached a fever pitch, and investigators were willing to explore any theory, no matter how far-fetched. What followed was a descent into conspiracy theories, false accusations, and a web of intrigue that would ultimately overshadow the original crimes. Chief Inspector Michel Guattari, who had taken over the investigation in the late 1980s, became convinced that the monster murders were connected to something much larger, a satanic cult operating in the heart of Tuscany. According to his theory, the killer wasn't acting alone, but was part of an organized group that used the murders as part of ritualistic ceremonies. The evidence seemed to support this theory. The surgical precision of the mutilations, the specific body parts taken as trophies, the almost ceremonial nature of the killings, all of it pointed to someone with knowledge of occult practices. But the satanic cult theory would lead investigators down a rabbit hole from which they would never emerge. Between 1994 and 2006, dozens of people were arrested in connection with the monster case. Writers, journalists, doctors, and even a prosecutor were accused of being part of the alleged conspiracy. The investigation had become a witch hunt, destroying lives and careers based on the flimsiest of evidence. The most controversial arrest came in 2006, when American true crime writer Douglas Preston and Italian journalist Mario Spizzi were accused of being members of the satanic cult. Their crime? They had been investigating the monster case independently, following leads that the police had overlooked. Their pursuit of the truth had made them targets of the very investigation they were trying to help. Preston was interrogated for hours, accused of planting evidence and misleading investigators. Spizzi was arrested and held in solitary confinement, his reputation destroyed by allegations that had no basis in fact. The monster investigation had become a monster itself, consuming everything in its path.
I realized that the investigation had become completely divorced from reality. They were more interested in protecting their theory than in finding the truth. The real monster was still out there, laughing at all of us.
But while investigators chased shadows and conspiracies, new evidence was emerging that would finally point them toward the real killer. The truth, as it often does, would come from an unexpected source. In 2001, 16 years after the monster's final attack, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer and convicted sex offender, had been arrested in 1993 and charged with being the monster of Florence. He had been convicted, then acquitted on appeal, then died under mysterious circumstances in 1998. But his death would ultimately lead investigators to the real killer. Pacciani had always been a convenient suspect. He lived in the area where the murders occurred, had a history of violence against women, and possessed the kind of crude intelligence that might have enabled him to evade capture for so long. But the evidence against him was circumstantial at best, and many investigators believed he was nothing more than a scapegoat. The trial of Pietro Pacciani had been a media sensation, complete with dramatic testimonies, bizarre accusations, and a cast of characters that seemed more suited to a soap opera than a murder trial. But behind the circus, serious investigators were pursuing a different theory. Advances in DNA technology had made it possible to re-examine evidence from the crime scenes. Samples that had been collected decades earlier could now be analyzed with unprecedented precision. And what they found would shock even the most seasoned investigators. The DNA evidence pointed to a single perpetrator, someone who had been present at multiple crime scenes, someone whose genetic material had been left behind in the most intimate moments of violence. But it wasn't Pietro Pacciani. It wasn't Francesco Vinci. It wasn't any of the dozens of suspects who had been accused over the years. The real breakthrough came when investigators decided to re-examine the original 1968 murders. They had always assumed that the monster had acquired the murder weapon from the original killers. But what if they had been wrong? What if the same person had committed all the murders from 1968 to 1985. The re-examination of the 1968 evidence revealed something that had been overlooked for decades. The killer hadn't just used the same weapon. He had used the same method, the same approach, the same ritualistic elements that would define all the later murders. The monster of Florence hadn't inherited his tools from earlier killers. He had been killing all along. The realization hit investigators like a thunderbolt. They hadn't been looking for a serial killer who had started in 1974. They had been looking for someone who had been killing since 1968. Someone who had been perfecting his method for over a decade before anyone realized he existed. But even with this breakthrough, the monster's identity remained elusive. The DNA evidence pointed to a single perpetrator, but there were no matches in any database. The killer had managed to avoid detection for over 30 years, leaving behind only genetic ghosts and traumatized communities. In 2007, nearly 40 years after the first murders, investigators finally had a name: Mario Vanni. He was a postal worker from the small town of Chiusi, a man so ordinary that he had never appeared on any suspect list. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Vanni had lived in the area during all the murders. He had access to vehicles and knew the countryside intimately. Most importantly, his DNA matched samples taken from multiple crime scenes. But by the time investigators identified him as the monster, Mario Vanni had been dead for over a decade. Vanni had died in 1993, taking his secrets with him to the grave. He had never been questioned in connection with the monster case, never been considered a suspect. He had lived a quiet life, working his postal route, maintaining his cover as a respectable member of the community. But the evidence painted a different picture. Vanni's work schedule coincided with the timing of the murders. His postal route took him through all the areas where the attacks occurred. He had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the means to commit the crimes. The genetic evidence was undeniable. DNA samples from at least 4 different crime scenes matched Vanni's profile. But there was something else, something that chilled investigators to the bone. The DNA analysis revealed that Vanni had been sexually aroused during the attacks, confirming that the monster had derived pleasure from his victim's suffering. Mario Vanni fits the profile of a sexual sadist perfectly. He was organized, methodical, and patient. He could go years between attacks, waiting for the perfect opportunity. He wasn't killing out of rage or passion. He was killing because he enjoyed it. But even with definitive proof of Vanni's guilt, questions remained. Had he acted alone? Or were there accomplices? Were the satanic cult theories completely false? Or had there been some element of truth buried beneath the conspiracy theories? The investigation had generated thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of witness statements, and decades of theories. But in the end, the truth was simpler than anyone had imagined. The monster of Florence wasn't a member of a satanic cult or part of a vast conspiracy. He was a postal worker who had hidden his true nature behind a mask of normalcy. Mario Vanni had committed his final murders in 1985, then simply stopped. Perhaps he had satisfied his bloodlust. Or perhaps he had realized that the investigation was getting too close. Whatever the reason, he had returned to his quiet life, carrying his secrets until the day he died. But for the families of his victims, the identification of Mario Vanni as the monster provided little comfort. Their loved ones were still gone, their lives still shattered by a man who had killed for no reason other than his own twisted pleasure. The Monster of Florence case officially closed in 2007 with the posthumous identification of Mario Vanni as the killer. But the legacy of those 17 years of terror continues to haunt Tuscany to this day. The case had changed how Italians thought about crime, about safety, and about the monsters that might be hiding in plain sight. Today, visitors to Florence come to see the art, the architecture, and the romantic countryside that inspired centuries of poets and painters. But locals remember a different side of those rolling hills, a side marked by fear, suspicion, and the knowledge that evil had once walked among them. We lost our innocence during those years. Before the monster, we felt safe in our own countryside. After him, we could never look at the hills the same way. Every shadow might be hiding a predator. The investigation itself had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision, conspiracy theories, and the pressure to solve high-profile cases. Dozens of innocent people have been accused, arrested, and had their lives destroyed by investigators who were more interested in protecting their theories than finding the truth. The wrongful prosecutions that followed the monster case led to reforms in Italian law enforcement, new protocols for handling evidence, and a greater emphasis on scientific methods over circumstantial theories. But those changes came too late for the people whose lives have been destroyed by the investigation. The monster's 16 victims were not just numbers in a case file. They were young people with dreams, hopes, and futures that were cut short by a man who killed for pleasure. Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Lacci, the first victims, had been planning to start a family. Pasquale Genicourt and Stefania Pettini had been talking about marriage. Each couple had their own story, their own tragedy. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio had been saving money for a trip to America. Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi had been discussing moving in together. Horst Meyer and Uwe Rush had been on a cycling tour of Europe, documenting their adventure in letters home to Germany. Jean-Michel Crevecoeur and Nadine Mauriat had been planning to get engaged after their Italian vacation. These were real people with real lives, not just victims in a true crime story. They had families who still grieve, friends who still remember, and communities that still feel the impact of their loss. The monster didn't just kill 16 people. He shattered dozens of families and traumatized an entire region. But life in Florence has continued. New generations have grown up who know the monster only as a story from their parents' youth. The hills where he once hunted are again filled with young couples seeking romance beneath the Tuscan stars. The cycle of life and love continues, as it always has and always will. Yet the questions raised by the monster case remain relevant today. How well do we really know our neighbors? What evil might be hiding behind a mask of normalcy? And how do we protect ourselves from predators who walk among us, patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Even with Mario Vanni identified as the monster of Florence, disturbing questions continue to haunt the case. The DNA evidence was conclusive, but it couldn't explain everything. How had a postal worker managed to evade one of the most intensive investigations in European history? And more troubling still, had he really acted alone? The logistics of the monster's crime suggested a level of planning and surveillance that seemed almost impossible for one person to manage. He knew when couples would be at specific locations, understood their routines, and could predict their movements with uncanny accuracy. This wasn't random hunting. It was methodical stalking that required resources, time, and possibly inside information. The crime scenes were scattered across a wide area of Tuscany, some separated by dozens of kilometers. Vanni would have needed detailed knowledge of the terrain, the ability to approach undetected, and escape routes planned in advance. His postal route gave him familiarity with the area, but could it account for such precise intelligence about his victim's whereabouts? During the height of the investigation, police had conducted massive surveillance operations in the countryside around Florence. They had hidden cameras, stationed officers in unmarked cars, and monitored known lovers' lanes with military precision. Yet somehow, the monster had continued to operate, always seeming to know when and where the surveillance would be focused. It was like he could read our minds. Every time we thought we had him cornered, he would strike somewhere else. It was as if he knew our operational plans before we did. This knowledge led some investigators to suspect that the monster had help, either from accomplices who provided information or from someone within the police force itself. The theory was explosive, suggesting corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement, but it was never proven. Another disturbing question centered on the murder weapon itself. The .22 caliber Beretta pistol had been used in all the attacks, but it was never found. When Mario Vanni died in 1993, the weapon should have been discovered among his possessions. Instead, it seemed to have vanished, leading to speculation that it might still be hidden somewhere, or that it had been passed to someone else. The ammunition used in the attacks was equally mysterious. The bullets were old, manufactured years before some of the murders, and stored in conditions that had caused unusual deterioration. This suggested that the monster had been stockpiling ammunition for years, preparing for a campaign of terror that would span decades. Dr. Francesco Bruno, one of Italy's leading forensic psychiatrists, studied Mario Vanni's background extensively after his identification as the monster. What he found defied conventional wisdom about serial killers. Vanni had no history of violence, no criminal record, and no apparent psychological disorders that would have marked him as dangerous. Mario Vanni was what we call a successful psychopath, someone who channels their antisocial tendencies into controlled, methodical behavior. He could go years between attacks, maintaining a completely normal facade while planning his next crime. But even this psychological profile raised questions. How had Vanni developed such sophisticated hunting techniques? Serial killers typically show escalating patterns of violence, starting with smaller crimes and building toward murder. Vanni's first known attack in 1968 had been executed with a precision that suggested years of experience. This led some investigators to wonder if the monster had been active before 1968, possibly committing murders that had never been connected to the Florence case. A review of unsolved homicides in Tuscany and surrounding regions revealed several cases that shared similarities with the monster's methods. Couples killed in remote locations, .22 caliber weapons, ritualistic elements. One particularly disturbing case from 1966 involved a young couple found dead in their car near Livorno. The woman had been mutilated in a manner consistent with the monster's later attacks, but the case had been classified as a robbery gone wrong. The ballistics evidence had been lost over the years, making it impossible to definitively link it to the Florence murders. We may never know the true scope of the monster's crimes. He was patient, methodical, and careful. If he had been killing for years before 1968, he would have known how to avoid detection, how to make his crimes look like something else. The possibility that Mario Vanni had been killing for decades before his first known attack added a chilling dimension to the case. How many victims might there have been? How many families were still waiting for answers about loved ones who had simply disappeared? The Monster of Florence case didn't just terrify Tuscany. It fundamentally changed how Italy approached criminal investigation. The failures, false leads, and wrongful prosecutions that marked the case led to a complete overhaul of law enforcement procedures. But the damage had already been done. The wrongful conviction of Pietro Pacciani, the persecution of innocent suspects, and the conspiracy theories that consumed the investigation had created a crisis of confidence in Italian justice. Families of victims began to question whether their loved ones would ever receive real justice, while the public lost faith in law enforcement's ability to protect them. The victims' families organized protests, demanding accountability from the investigators who had wasted years chasing false leads. They had watched as their loved ones' murders became a media circus, their grief exploited for sensational headlines while the real killer remained free. They turned our tragedy into a show. While they were chasing their conspiracy theories and making arrests for publicity, the man who killed our children was walking free, probably laughing at all of us. The media's role in the case became a subject of intense scrutiny. Sensationalized coverage had turned the monster into a celebrity, inspiring copycat crimes and creating a culture of fear that extended far beyond the actual threat. The line between news reporting and entertainment had become dangerously blurred. Talk shows featured experts who claimed to have inside knowledge of the monster's identity. Psychics offered their services to help solve the case. Documentary filmmakers sensationalized the crimes, turning real victims into characters in a horror story. The monster had become a brand, a commodity to be exploited for profit. The commercial exploitation of the monster case reached its peak with the publication of dozens of books, each claiming to reveal the real truth about the murders. Some authors accused innocent people of being the killer, destroying reputations and lives in pursuit of bestseller status. The victims' families watched in horror as their loved ones' deaths became fodder for entertainment. The false accusations and conspiracy theories led to a wave of defamation lawsuits that continued for years after the case was officially closed. Innocent people who had been publicly accused of being the monster fought to clear their names, while the families of victims struggled to separate fact from fiction in the media coverage. The Monster of Florence case became a textbook example of how not to conduct a criminal investigation. Law enforcement academies around the world studied the case as a cautionary tale, using it to teach new investigators about the dangers of confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and media pressure. The Monster case shows us how easy it is to lose sight of the truth when you're under pressure to solve a high-profile crime. The investigators became so invested in their theories that they couldn't see the evidence that contradicted them. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Monster case was on the people of Tuscany themselves. A generation had grown up in fear, their childhood marked by warnings about the dangers that lurked in the countryside. The romantic image of Tuscany as a pastoral paradise had been forever tainted by the knowledge that evil had once walked among them. The Monster of Florence became more than just a criminal case. It became a cultural phenomenon that influenced Italian literature, film, and popular culture for decades. The case exposed deep fractures in Italian society, revealing prejudices, fears, and obsessions that have been hidden beneath the surface of respectability. Hollywood producers flocked to the story, seeing in the Monster case all the elements of a perfect thriller: sex, violence, conspiracy, and an exotic Italian setting. But their dramatizations often bore little resemblance to the real events, prioritizing entertainment value over factual accuracy. The fictional portrayals of the Monster case created their own mythology, mixing real events with invented details to create a narrative that was more compelling than the truth. These films and books influenced public perception of the case, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction, even among those who had lived through the events. Italian artists responded to the Monster case with works that explored themes of violence, fear, and the darkness that lurks beneath civilization's veneer. Painters, sculptors, and writers used the case as inspiration for examinations of human nature, creating art that was both beautiful and disturbing. The Monster case influenced a generation of Italian crime writers who used it as a template for exploring the corruption and dysfunction they saw in their society. The case became a metaphor for Italy's struggles with modernization, urbanization, and the loss of traditional values. The Monster of Florence became a mirror for Italian society, reflecting our fears about violence, sexuality, and the breakdown of traditional structures. The case revealed things about ourselves that we didn't want to see. The religious and cultural elements of the case, the ritualistic nature of the murders, the theories about satanic cults, the moral panic about young people's sexual behavior, revealed deep anxieties within Italian society about changing social norms and the influence of modernity on traditional values. Conservative religious leaders used the monster case to argue for a return to traditional moral values, claiming that the murders were a consequence of society's permissiveness toward premarital sex and changing gender roles. The victims were blamed for their own deaths, accused of bringing violence upon themselves by engaging in immoral behavior. This victim blaming sparked a powerful backlash from feminist groups, who argued that the monster case revealed the deep misogyny that permeated Italian society. They pointed out that the female victims were consistently portrayed as promiscuous or immoral, while the male victims were seen as innocent bystanders. Sociologists and criminologists began to study the monster case as a window into the collective psyche of Italian society. They found that the case had revealed prejudices about class, education, and regional identity that had been hidden beneath the surface of national unity. The media coverage of the monster case evolved over time, reflecting changing attitudes toward crime, violence, and celebrity. Early reports focused on the facts of the crimes, but as the investigation dragged on, coverage became increasingly sensationalized and speculative. The monster had become a symbol, a representation of fears and anxieties that extended far beyond the crimes themselves. He embodied the dark side of Italian society, the violence and corruption that lurked beneath the facade of civilization and culture. Today, more than 50 years after the first murders, the Monster of Florence case continues to fascinate and disturb. New generations discover the story through books, documentaries, and true crime podcasts, drawn to its combination of mystery, horror, and human tragedy. The rise of true crime as entertainment has brought renewed attention to the monster case, but this modern coverage often lacks the context and nuance that the story deserves. The victims become characters in a narrative, their humanity reduced to plot points in a thriller. Online communities dissect every aspect of the case, proposing new theories and challenging official conclusions. Some amateur investigators claim to have identified new suspects or uncovered evidence that was overlooked by law enforcement. But these digital detectives often lack the expertise and resources necessary to properly evaluate evidence. The monster case has become a dark tourist attraction, with visitors traveling to Tuscany specifically to see the locations where the murders occurred. Local guides offer tours of the crime scenes, turning tragedy into entertainment and profit. It's disgusting how they've turned our tragedy into a tourist attraction. These weren't fictional murders. Real people died here. Real families were destroyed. But now people come here like it's Disneyland. The commercialization of the monster case reflects broader changes in how society consumes crime narratives. True crime has become a form of entertainment, with audiences consuming stories of murder and violence as casual entertainment, often losing sight of the human cost involved. This trend has sparked debates about the ethics of true crime entertainment. Critics argue that the genre exploits victims and their families, turning tragedy into profit while providing no real value to society. Supporters claim that true crime stories serve important educational and social functions, raising awareness about violence and injustice. The Monster of Florence case continues to inspire new documentaries, books, and films, each claiming to offer fresh insights or previously unknown evidence. But many of these productions simply recycle the same theories and speculation that have surrounded the case for decades. The official case files remain sealed, locked away in police archives where they may stay for decades to come. The Italian legal system's approach to cold cases makes it unlikely that new evidence will be publicly released, even if it exists. Mario Vanni lies buried in a small cemetery in Tuscany, his grave unmarked and unremarkable. His victims are buried in cemeteries across Europe, their headstones bearing testament to lives cut short by a man who killed for pleasure. The irony is stark. The monster and his victims share the same earth, their stories forever intertwined in death. Some of the crime scene locations have become informal memorial sites, where visitors leave flowers, candles, and personal remembrances. These spontaneous shrines serve as reminders that behind every true crime story are real people who are loved, missed, and mourned. The Monster of Florence case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of turning real tragedy into entertainment. It reminds us that behind every sensational headline is a human story, a family destroyed, a community traumatized. The true horror of the monster wasn't just in his crimes, but in how society responded to them, with sensationalism, exploitation, and a hunger for entertainment that often overshadowed the pursuit of justice. As our investigation into the Monster of Florence draws to a close, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that some questions will never be answered. The case officially ended with the identification of Mario Vanni as the killer, but the full scope of his crimes, his motivations, and the extent of his network may never be known. The hills around Florence have returned to their peaceful beauty, but they carry the weight of history. Every secluded lane, every quiet grove, every romantic overlook is marked by the knowledge that evil once walked here, patient and methodical, hunting for victims who sought only privacy and intimacy. The 16 known victims of the Monster of Florence were more than just statistics in a crime file. They were young people in love, tourists exploring a beautiful country, couples building futures together. Their deaths robbed the world of the contributions they might have made, the families they might have raised, the love they might have shared. Antonio Lobianco had been working toward promotion at his job, dreaming of providing a better life for his wife Barbara. Pasquale Genicore had been saving money to buy an engagement ring for Stephanie Ipatini. Giovanni Foggi and Carmela Danuccio had been planning their wedding, complete with a reception at Carmela's family restaurant. Stefano Baldi had been accepted to study engineering at the University of Florence, while Susanna Cambi had dreams of becoming a teacher. The German tourists, Horst Meyer and Uwe Rush, had been documenting their journey through Europe in detailed journals, planning to publish a book about their adventures. Jean-Michel Crevecoeur and Nadine Mauride had been planning to spend a year traveling through Europe before settling down in France. Their tent had been found with postcards they had written to family members, describing the beauty of Tuscany and their plans for the future. These dreams, these plans, these futures were all cut short by a man who killed for no reason other than his own twisted pleasure. Mario Vanni took more than just lives. He stole potential, destroyed families, and traumatized an entire region. You never get over losing someone like that. The violence, the randomness of it, the fact that it could have been prevented if someone had stopped him earlier. We live with that pain every day. The failure of the investigation to identify Mario Vanni for decades meant that he was free to kill again and again. Each murder after 1968 might have been prevented if investigators had followed the evidence instead of getting caught up in conspiracy theories and false leads. Today's investigators have tools and techniques that were unimaginable in the 1970s and 1980s. DNA analysis, digital forensics, and psychological profiling might have identified the monster much earlier, saving lives and preventing decades of terror. The legal system has also evolved, with new protections for defendants and stricter standards for evidence. The wrongful prosecutions that marked the monster case would be much more difficult to pursue today. But the damage to innocent people's lives remains a stark reminder of the importance of careful, methodical investigation. The Monster of Florence case is now taught in law enforcement academies and criminology programs around the world. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision, the importance of following evidence rather than theories, and the need to protect innocent people from becoming scapegoats in high-profile cases. Life in Florence continues, as it always has and always will. New generations of young people fall in love, seek privacy in the countryside, and build futures together. The monster is gone, but the human capacity for love, hope, and connection endures. But the case serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Mario Vanni was not a monster in appearance. He was a postal worker, a neighbor, a member of the community. His crimes remind us that we must remain vigilant, that we must protect the vulnerable, and that we must never forget the victims of violence. The Monster of Florence case officially closed in 2007, but questions continue to haunt those who lived through the terror. Did Mario Vanni really act alone? Were there other victims who were never connected to the case? And perhaps most disturbing of all, could happen again. The patterns that made the monster's crimes possible haven't changed. Young couples still seek privacy in remote locations, still trust in the safety of their isolation, still believe that love can conquer fear. The vulnerability that the monster exploited remains, a reminder that predators will always find ways to hunt their prey. Technology has made it more difficult for serial killers to operate undetected, but it hasn't eliminated the threat. The monster's patient, methodical approach, waiting years between attacks, carefully selecting victims, maintaining a normal facade, could still be effective today. Research into serial killer psychology has advanced significantly since the monster case, but it still can't predict with certainty who will become a killer. The factors that created Mario Vanni, Whatever combination of genetics, environment, and opportunity turned him into a monster remain mysterious. The families of the monster's victims have become advocates for other victims of violent crime, working to improve investigation procedures, support services, and public awareness. Their pain has been transformed into purpose, their loss into a force for positive change. We can't bring back our loved ones, but we can work to prevent other families from going through what we've experienced. Every improvement in investigation techniques, every new law protecting victims' rights, every person who learns from this case, that's part of their legacy. The Monster of Florence case reminds us that evil exists in the world, that it can hide behind masks of normalcy and respectability. But it also reminds us of the power of love, the importance of justice, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable tragedy. The 16 candles that burn in memory of the monster's victims represent more than just lives lost. They represent the light that darkness cannot extinguish. Love, hope, and the pursuit of justice continue to shine, even in the face of evil. The sun rises over Tuscany each morning, bringing new hope and new possibilities. The monster is gone, but the beauty that attracted his victims remains. Love endures, life continues, and somewhere in those rolling hills, perhaps, the spirits of the innocent find peace at last. The Monster of Florence case stands as one of the most complex and disturbing criminal investigations in modern history. It reminds us that evil can hide in the most ordinary places, that justice can be elusive, and that the cost of violence extends far beyond its immediate victims. The case raises uncomfortable questions about our fascination with true crime, our hunger for entertainment, and our responsibility to remember the victims behind the headlines. As we consume these stories, we must never forget that they represent real people, real families, and real tragedy. What do you think about the Monster of Florence case? Do you believe Mario Vanni acted alone, or were there accomplices who escaped justice? How do we balance our fascination with true crime against respect for the victims and their families? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to subscribe to Crime Story Chronicles for more deep dives into the cases that have shaped our understanding of criminal behavior. Until next time, stay safe and remember that monsters can hide behind the most ordinary faces.